This video is going to talk you through how the effects of climate change are uneven and a few things that we need to go over from last lesson. So on the screen there is a diagram of sea level rise. Sea level rise we know is caused by glaciers and ice sheets melting and by water expanding when sea temperatures increase. And that literally causes the sea level to rise. Sea level rise has really serious consequences. We're going to see more coastal erosion. So the cliffs at the coast are going to break down faster, and we're also going to see more coastal flooding. When there's stormy weather, we'll get higher tides, and so these houses here, when we got sea level rise, are more at risk, more likely to flood than before when we didn't have sea level rise. Remember that sea level rise causes flooding at the coasts. It does not cause flooding of rivers. So here we go, we're going to see more coastal erosion, we're going to see a faster rate of coastal erosion. So the cliffs are going to move backward faster, and that could cause some houses to having to be knocked down and for people to move out of those houses. We're going to see more coastal flooding caused by storms because that sea level rise is already higher. What that means is that our hard engineering, we can see in this picture they've got a sea wall. Our hard engineering is going to become less effective. It's going to be less good at protecting us from flooding at the coasts. And it's going to become more expensive to repair. So whereas before a 1 metre wall might have been enough to protect from the sea, because the sea level has risen, the sea's gone up by perhaps 1 metre, you're going to have to either build a higher wall or make a difficult choice between do you spend that money on building the wall or do you remove the people who are at risk of flooding and move them to a safer area. And we'll talk more about that later on. So we've got these severe effects of climate change because greenhouse gas emissions have increased since the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s. And you can see that on our graph. On the x-axis there is time, and on the y-axis there is the amount of CO2 that is being emitted by different countries. Remember that CO2 is only one of the greenhouse gases we've been looking at. We've been looking at CO2, we've been looking at methane, and we've also been looking at nitrous oxide. But CO2 is responsible for most of the enhanced greenhouse effect because there is more CO2 in the atmosphere than any other greenhouse gas. So we can see, since the late 1800s, about here, the total amount of greenhouse gases emitted by the world has increased. Let's look at who those big emitters are. Who are the countries that are releasing the most carbon dioxide? Well, the United States, they release a large amount of carbon dioxide. Europe, so the yellow and the orange combined, that's Europe, we release just under the amount that the United States does. China is another big producer of carbon dioxide. So HIC countries, that's like saying high income countries. HICs are responsible for most of the greenhouse gases that are currently in our atmosphere because they have been emitting greenhouse gases for the longest. Let's look back in 1850, it was Europe that was the biggest greenhouse gas emitter. 1900s, here we've got the United States joining in, producing lots of carbon dioxide. It's only relatively recently that China has started producing lots of carbon dioxide. So it's HICs are responsible for the amount of carbon dioxide that is in our atmosphere now. But NEEs, newly emerging economies, like China, are rapidly increasing the amount of carbon dioxide they produce. So where is all this carbon dioxide coming from? Well, we know that electricity, agriculture, and transport are big producers of greenhouse gases. When we say agriculture, what we're really looking at mostly is deforestation, when trees are chopped down and the land is turned into farms like palm oil farms and cattle ranches. When we're looking at electricity and heat and transport and other energy, what we're looking at is the burning of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas. If you're filling up your car with petrol, if you're filling up your car with diesel, they come from oil, so that's burning a fossil fuel. The most of our electricity that we use in our homes, so when you plug in your phone to charge, and most of the electricity that is used to make products comes from burning fossil fuels, mainly gas in the UK and mainly coal in China. So let's have a look at countries' energy use over time. Let's see if our link works. Great, here we go. Let's bring it right back. Let's bring it back to the 1970s. So we're in the 1970s. We've got energy production, so the amount of energy that a country produces on the y-axis, and we've got income on the x-axis. As we move along through time, we're now in the 1980s, we can see that the amount of energy that countries are producing has increased. Here we've got China. China is producing more energy, mostly from coal. Up here, that's the United States. Very high income, very high energy use. Let's keep going on in time. China is producing more energy. The United States is producing more energy. We're now seeing India, another NEE. They're starting to produce more energy. What's this one here? Russia, another NEE, producing more energy. All the way up. And we run out of data a bit. But what we are seeing is that the amount of energy countries are producing is increasing. And that is because the overall wealth of the world is increasing. And where does this energy come from? Well, it comes from burning fossil fuels. So the more energy that we produce, the more energy we're using, the more fossil fuels being burnt, and the more greenhouse gases are being released into the atmosphere. Here's another way of showing it. Look, here is a map of the world's coal power stations. So we have lots in North America. We've got another cluster here in China, in India. Look, so many in India. And a smaller cluster in Europe. That's because we tend to burn gas. Also a fossil fuel, but we tend to burn gas, not coal. So we can see most coal power stations are in what kind of countries? HICs and NEEs. Now let's look at the areas where we are not got a lot of coal production. Coal power stations. Here. Notice that Africa and South America are not on the map in terms of coal power stations. If we go back and look at the energy map, we didn't even register them as the dots. And that is because LICs are responsible for a very, very small amount of the greenhouse gases that are in our atmosphere. Let's go back to the graph at the beginning. Look, the entire continent of Africa releases less carbon dioxide than the entire country of India. Remember, Africa is a continent. Look how small their contribution is compared to China, compared to Europe, compared to the United States. So LICs produce very little greenhouse gases, and that's because they don't have the wealth. They're not consuming as much energy because the individuals within those countries can't afford to. But as countries develop, the amount of energy that they use and the amount of greenhouse gases that they produce in transport, in manufacturing, in buildings increases. And we can see this really clearly with Shenzhen. Shenzhen is a city in China. So we're looking there in this cluster. Now, Shenzhen has grown rapidly since the roughly about the 1970s. Here we can see Shenzhen in 1964. Most people are in agriculture, working agriculture. Shenzhen 2015, look at the infrastructure that's been built. We've got all these high-rise buildings. Remember that buildings, here we go, buildings are responsible for 6.4% of greenhouse gas emissions. We take just one road in Shenzhen, look at the increase in traffic on that road. So we've got an increase in buildings, we'll have an increase in energy usage, we've got an increase in traffic. And that just exemplifies how as countries develop, the amount of greenhouse gases they produce increases. Let's look at tropical tree cover loss now. So we're looking at deforestation in the rainforest on this graph. We go back to the beginning. Remember that agriculture was responsible for 24% of greenhouse gas emissions. And that a large proportion of that is coming from land that did have trees on, but is now being deforested. Those trees are being chopped down. And we can see that the rate of deforestation is increasing. Why is that a problem? Well, if there are less trees, they're going to absorb less CO2 from the air. Once those trees are chopped down and the land is turned into farmland, we're going to get more methane production. If that land is being used to farm cattle. So cattle produce methane. Crops, what greenhouse gas do they produce? Well, we fertilise the crops with nitrogen fertiliser. So the crops themselves don't produce any greenhouse gases, but the fertiliser that is designed to make the crops grow well creates the gas nitrous oxide, because the nitrogen fertilizer reacts with the oxygen in the air. So when these trees are being cut down, we're seeing a large increase in the amount of greenhouse gases that are being produced. So why is the amount of deforestation increasing? Well, we looked at the improvements of quality of life in Shenzhen. This is a story that is happening for countries across the world. India, Russia, China, these are all countries who have been growing. Their economy and their quality of life has been improving. What this means is that there is more demand for things that come from the rainforest, like palm oil and like cattle. Here we go. Here we've got a picture of palm oil plantations in Indonesia. The main cause of deforestation is palm oil. In the Amazon rainforest, the main cause of deforestation is cattle ranching. And here is just another example of how we're seeing in newly emerging economies, like China, this is a Chinese example, the growth of cities and an increase in the demand for energy. To sum that all up, let's have a look at this map. This is a carbon dioxide emissions per capita, so per person in 2017. Who are the biggest emitters? Who is releasing the most carbon dioxide in tonnes per person per year? Well, over here we got a country in red, two countries in fact, the United States and Canada. Here, Australia, another big emitter. And what we'll see if we look at the general trends on the map is that high-income countries produce the most carbon dioxide per person. And again, we've got a gap here. Sub-Saharan Africa, where some of the poorest countries in the world are located. And here in Southeast Asia, where again another cluster of very poor countries, their carbon dioxide emissions are very low. So why am I telling you all this? Why are we bothered about who produces the most greenhouse gases? Well, let's look at who's most at risk of climate change. So we know that greenhouse gas emissions are going to lead to climate change, which is going to cause an increase in extreme weather, sea levels rising, the spread of tropical diseases, a whole host of really serious effects. And some countries are better prepared to manage those effects than other countries. So here is a map of climate change risk. Basically, it's looking at what countries are going to suffer the most from climate change. Look, we got a whole red band here through sub-Saharan Africa. These are the countries that are going to see the most serious damage from climate change. Okay, what about the countries that aren't really at risk? Oh, look, we got United States here, Canada, Europe. What kind of countries are they? They're the HICs. So we put the two against each other. We've got almost like a negative relationship. The countries that produce the least greenhouse gases are going to suffer the most from climate change, while the countries that produce the most greenhouse gases are going to suffer the least from climate change. So climate change is often called a really unjust thing because of this. The people who are responsible for it are not the people who are going to face the most serious consequences. So why is it that low-income countries, why is it that they're red? Why are they not going to be able to cope with climate change very well? Well, in low-income countries, there are lots of individuals who have low incomes. As a result, the government doesn't get very much tax. So tax is what people have to pay the government on money that they get from their job. So I pay the government tax, and it helps pay for your education, it helps build roads, it helps build flood defences. But in LICs, they got low incomes, so the government doesn't get very little tax. Therefore, it's difficult to build protection. It's difficult to cope with sea level rise because you can't afford to build a seawall. It's difficult to cope with tropical storms that we're going to see an increase of because you can't afford to build good quality infrastructure. It's also difficult to rebuild after an extreme event has happened, so the effects will last longer. LICs also have poor infrastructure. Why? Because they have low incomes and few building regulations. So the fact that they got low incomes, few building regulations leads to poor infrastructure, and therefore when extreme weather events do come around, there's more damage to infrastructure, and as a result there's more deaths. So let's put this into context, right? A context that we've already studied. Here, diagram A, we see a computer model of the most severe tropical storms that happen today. And we can see that they're located in the tropics, and that's because the ocean temperature there reaches 27 degrees. Here, we can see by the end of the 21st century where these storms are going to be. And we can see that there are more storms, and that the storms are in new locations. That's because new areas of ocean are going to be reaching that 27 degrees because the earth will have warmed. So what we could be seeing is an increase in the intensity, so in the strength of tropical storms that are hitting low-income countries, and an increase in the frequency, how often they're hitting. So low-income countries could see more storms and more damaging storms in the future as a result of climate change. We've looked at this to some extent before when we looked at the Philippines. I just want you to think about this question for a second. Why was the Philippines vulnerable to Typhoon Haiyan? Well, the infrastructure was very poor quality. So when those high wind speeds came through, the infrastructure wasn't strong enough to protect the people from it. They had very poor sanitation anyway, so when the sanitation infrastructure, so sewages, were damaged, that caused a lot of extra deaths. Their hospitals were under a lot of strain, so they couldn't cope with the number of people who were coming into them. All of these factors meant that the Philippines suffered more damage than if the same storm was to hit HIC. But what's more worrying is not only that these LICs, like the Philippines, have more damage when extreme weather events hit them, but that they don't recover from that as well. So if we look again We're looking a year later, we can see that the infrastructure is still poor quality. If another typhoon was to hit the Philippines, that infrastructure is going to get damaged again because they've not been able to rebuild it to a standard where it's going to be able to protect people. And that's because they've got low incomes and few building regulations. So it becomes a vicious cycle. Once you get one extreme weather event, you're unable to recover, then you get another one because they're becoming more frequent, and you're unable to recover, and the situation gets worse and worse. So, just to summarize them, let's go back to the beginning. We're producing more greenhouse gases, and we are going to see serious effects of climate change. The countries that are responsible for the most greenhouse gases, like the United States, like us in Europe, we are not going to see the most damage from climate change. We're able to cope with the extreme weather. We've got the resources to do that. We've got the wealth to do that. However, low-income countries are unable to cope with climate change as well as we are, even though they haven't produced as much greenhouse gas. And just to clarify, it's sub-Saharan Africa that's going to see the worst damage. But we looked at the example of the Philippines because that's something that we've already looked at. The Philippines is located here in Southeast Asia. To understand why some places are not going to be able to cope as well and are going to see more damage.